Well, I'd like to welcome everybody to, is this our third or fourth broadband summit put on by the state members of the Federal State Joint Conference on Advanced Services? This conference is set up by Section 706 of the Telecommunications Act, and so it's often called the 706 Joint Conference. It consists of a number of state commissioners. The state chair is Commissioner Sandoval from California. I'm the vice chair for what that is worth. And the rest of the joint conference is made up of the 5 FCC commissioners. The purpose of the 706 Joint Conference is to advise the FCC on broadband matters and particularly how to improve broadband deployment and adoption. And that's what this conference is here today about. We have 3 distinguished panels on availability, on adoption, and on advances in technology. And we will be moving forward as soon as we can round up our speakers who have been delayed by the rain.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, great round of thanks to Commissioner Sayre and especially to the whole New York Public Service Commission staff for your leadership in organizing this conference. So let's give them a round of applause for everything that they've done to organize this conference. So thank you, and welcome to the Section 706 conference. We had a terrific conference at the last NARUC meeting in San Francisco that a number of us helped to organize, where we talked about broadband access, availability, and adoption, and new and innovative technologies, as well as the policies that are important to all of the above. So these issues remain critical and exciting. I was sharing with some of the New York staff, very excited being here. You have such robust backhaul that makes all sorts of services possible and robust infrastructure. So I was watching a commercial the other day and watching with jealousy the offer of internet at speeds of 300 megabits per second down, speeds which are not available in my home in the Silicon Valley. So while we are the seed of a lot of innovation and a place where a lot of apps are developed, even in the Silicon Valley, broadband is not robustly deployed everywhere. And as we'll hear about when we get to talking about access, there are still many gaps in access. I had the opportunity to be one of the co-organizers of an Apps for Ag hackathon that we organized with the U.S. Department of Agriculture and also a number of leaders in the private sector, particularly in the agricultural sector. And this hackathon, it was held in Coalinga, California, home of many cows and ranches and also oil fields. One of the rules was that every team had to have a farmer and a coder. And everybody either wore cowboy boots or tennis shoes, which also marked which camp you were in. I'm from LA, but I wore cowboy boots, also reflecting my rural roots from a small town. My parents are from a small town in Arizona that is still served by a rural electric cooperative. But as we were developing the apps, and in my opening remarks to the coders there, I talked about one of the things that you had to plan for with the apps was that when you're on a lot of farm fields in California, no communications is available. There is no wireless. And earlier that day, I had visited a field of a farmer named Joe Del Bosque, who is on the California Water Commission. And he said actually his most productive crop is a cell phone tower on one of his fields. And not only does he make a lot of money from the cell phone tower, but it really helps him to get productivity and connectivity. And indeed, in his office that is less than a mile from that tower, I did a measurement using our CalSpeed app to measure wireless speeds, and he had nearly 25 megabits per second symmetrical access, largely due to that cell phone tower. Then we jumped in the truck and saw some of the other fields, and I ran a cow speed test when we were at his cherry orchards. And in running that test, we found that though we were less than a mile and a half from that cell phone tower, the speeds were less than dial-up speeds. And you couldn't do a lot of sophisticated apps. And as we went to the end of the cherry orchards, there was no connectivity. Now, there's actually no propagation that would predict that a mile and a half on pancake flat land that you would have no connectivity. But what it means is that in California, we can't use all the great things we heard about yesterday in that terrific panel on how we can use broadband and telecom to feed the world and in rural America where you don't have the connectivity. So actually everybody had to design their apps assuming that the farmers, the irrigation managers, the farm workers would go to a place in the morning, either at the office or go to a town where there's connectivity, be able to download information. You had to assume in your app that you couldn't communicate with anybody else except by shouting at a person who happened to be on your same field, and that you would have no connectivity to the cloud. And then you would be able to go back at the end of the day or the next morning and then be able to upload and download. So this is really hurting our ability to be able to manage water and energy and manage our critical resources, as well as creating public safety gaps. So the people of Silicon Valley were very interested in helping solve these problems. And we're also here in the great state of New York, where California and New York also share a pattern, which is the most underconnected places in California and New York are similarly here in New York. New York City has the lowest levels of broadband adoption, and the Adirondacks has had the lowest level of broadband access. And in California, Los Angeles has the lowest levels of broadband adoption, and very far northern California, where I was last week, has the lowest level of broadband access. I visited central offices last week that had no DSL deployed. They had phone lines and they had T1s at 1.5 megabits per second down and less than 1 up. And so access remains a critical issue. Where there's no access, there's nothing to adopt. And in places like Los Angeles and New York, adoption is also often influenced by income, by training, by language, by a variety of other factors. So we're very excited to have this conference today to talk about these issues. Also, I wanted to mention that Commissioner Rosenworcel sends her deepest regrets. She was really looking forward to being here. We've been talking over the months, and she is our FCC liaison to the 706 committee. Her advisor, Travis Lippman, is on his way to deliver her remarks in her place. There's an FCC meeting tomorrow, so she was detained by the press of business there and unanticipated issues that arose. Travis is trying to make his way. He was detained when his plane was kept on the ground 2 hours late in D.C. So when he comes, we'll fold him into the next panel. And we also understand some of our local panelists might be detained by the rain and other things. But we will press on and just fold people in as they come in. So if we have to readjust the order, and I know there's some experts here, you might be recruited to come and be on a panel. So we'll see. I'm looking at, I know that Sunny Wright McPeak is an example of somebody we could recruit, so if we need to. So with no further ado, then, I will let Commissioner Sayre take the microphone to begin and moderate the first panel. So thank you, all of you, to being here. I know it's been a long conference for all of us who've been here at NARUC. Thank you for making your plans to stay. Thank you, all commissioners and our State 706 committee members. Really appreciate it. Commissioner Sayre, thank you.
The first panel is on broadband availability, and obviously you can't have broadband service if you don't have the broadband network in the first place. The issues of availability involve not just the underlying technology, whether it be done with fiber or wireless or copper or speed, but that it be run in such a way that people can take advantage of the services along it. I am aware of a wonderful fiber network in Western New York that was built at great public expense that goes to many, many villages in one fairly rural county out in Western New York. And people along the route of that fiber network are calling up the county commissioners and saying, well, I see this wonderful fiber in my front yard. Can I get some service? And the answer has been, sorry, we actually don't have a service provider yet who's providing residential access off of that fiber. We just have the fiber. So availability involves a whole lot of things. And without further ado, I'd like to turn to our first panelist, Deb Socia, who is the director of Next Century Cities, who has some ideas about how cities can not fall into the trap of this fiber network that I just mentioned.
Okay, thanks for inviting me here today. I appreciate the opportunity to join you at the 706 Joint Conference. And I am the executive director of Next Century Cities. Hello. And we are a nonprofit that supports cities that would like to have fast, affordable, reliable internet access. Next Century Cities comes from a convening of mayors who all got together and shared concerns they have about the obstacles they face when they're trying to get fast, affordable, reliable internet in their communities. Sort of the conversation that you mentioned earlier, you have this community that has very limited access, and in fact, a lot of the country still only has dial-up or satellite as their options. Very expensive, they have caps, there's all kinds of issues, and it's a much larger number than you'd imagine. So the mayors really wanted a way to connect. They wanted to collaborate with their peers from around the country. They wanted to learn from each other's successes and each other's failures so that they wouldn't repeat the mistakes, but there's no reason they should also have to repeat the process. Let's learn from each other. So they also wanted a go-to group that would offer non-biased support. And so that brought about Next Century Cities. And we launched on October 20th of last year. We're not yet a year old, but we already have 102 cities and counties on board. And I think the reason we've had this incredible growth is that people are just looking for information and opportunity. And people are frustrated and looking for solutions. So our cities are rural, suburban, and urban. So we see all of the issues you suggested. Our cities are conservative and progressive. They're spread across the country. They're cities that all share this concern for broadband availability, and they run the gamut from cities that have no idea what they're going to do to cities that have a gig and are using it well. So we don't represent any one way of doing this or one type of community. We represent anybody who's interested and who cares about this issue. So if you could. So our principles came directly out of that conversation with our mayors. We know, everybody in this room, that high-speed access is just necessary infrastructure. It ought not to even be a question any longer. It improves your quality of life. It's about transportation, education, healthcare, public safety, e-government, economic development, and it's about agriculture. So when I heard you talking about that, we have people that are using drones now to keep track of how their crops are doing and that are using sensors in the soil so that they can conserve water and use only what they need. All of these things require access. And so when people assume that the rural communities aren't as needy for this infrastructure, they're just wrong, right? That's really necessary across the board and across the country. So, and the other thing we're really clearly about is this just isn't a partisan issue. Though sometimes at the federal level we get a little partisan around this, it is not partisan at the ground level, because at the ground level it's about people. It's about realistically understanding what people need to be successful now, and that is not partisan. And then third, we believe that how you manage your access should be up to the community or the county, right? That this should be a decision made at the ground level, not by people outside of our communities. And so, you know, it's a tricky one because I know that people worry a lot about when cities build their own broadband network. However, and quite frankly, I think it's a risk for sure, but quite frankly, they're doing it because there isn't another option. If the market solved this problem, we wouldn't be building local networks. But it hasn't solved the problem, and so therefore, we need to allow our cities to do whatever it takes to get where they want to go. And by the way, both Chattanooga and Wilson, Chattanooga, Tennessee, and Wilson, North Carolina, are cities in Next Century Cities. They're members, and both of those are the cities that petitioned the FCC to overturn the state regulations that prevented them from growing their network, which Chairman Wheeler did overturn this year. We're still waiting on the legal battles to play out, but that is actually a big step in empowering cities to make decisions. We also think that everybody, and as I said earlier, should have the opportunity to benefit from this resource, no matter where you are in the country, no matter your income level. We do believe that competition is important. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone that in just about any market you can imagine, competition is beneficial to the consumer. And then finally, as Ken Hayes from the Enterprise Center in Chattanooga always says, working together works. And so we really believe in collaboration, and that's why we work as a collaboration of mayors. So we support our cities, directly addressing issues they might have. Somebody calls me up and says, I have a problem with my Dig Once policy. I need some help on this, and I happen to know the expert on Dig Once in the country. I call them and I make the connection, and they can help one another out. We help cities not have to do all that research on their own, and counties, by the way. So it's a lot of direct interventions. It's a lot of learning opportunities. We surveyed everybody, said, what do you need to know about? They told us. We do webinars. There are toolkits on our site. In specific, you will find under resources a bunch of toolkits we've already created, and they're open and free. And then we connect cities to experts in the field, and we elevate their stories nationally. We want to tell their stories. And so now I'll tell you about the ways in which our people are providing access. How are they partnering? How are they working together? So some are working with the incumbent providers, AT&T, Comcast, and so forth. Some are working with Google. And so there are pros and cons to every approach, and the pros there are clear, right? It's easy to do. There's no financial risk. It's absolutely a simple process for cities. Granted, there are some complications, but that's a fairly low-risk option. But there are some negatives too, and one is that you can't require them to build everywhere. So you end up with maybe parts of your county that get covered, but not all of your county that gets covered. These are for-profit companies, and I support them 100% in their desire to make money. This is what they do. That means that they are motivated by profit. When you are motivated by profit, you're looking for densely populated, not quite so spread out. It's very expensive to take care of our rural communities, so it's not always an alternative there. And then we have public-private partnerships, and probably the most recent one that I've seen that I think is really playing out very well is Westminster, Maryland, and they're partnering with Ting. And the nice thing about this, the pro, is that it's limited risk to the city. It's a shared risk model. There's also a shared reward. Eventually, that network will be owned by the city. The con to that model, in my mind, is first of all, it's pretty new, and so we don't have a huge track record on it. And secondly, you really have to pick your collaborator well, right? The person you partner with has got to be somebody that you know you can trust in the long term. Then we have open access networks, which a lot of our cities are doing, leasing out their fiber. That's pretty low risk. It does cost some money. It can provide the city with some income. For example, Santa Monica leases some of its fiber and gets back $70,000 a month, and then can use that money to invest in the network. It's a city-owned asset. The negative is it does need good management, and one of the things I tell folks, probably the most important thing you can do when you're working on this is get the right person, right? Hire the right person. And then there are municipal utilities, and honestly, they're a wide range, right? In some cases, they're building fiber to the home. In some cases, they're just building out to the business district. In some cases, it's an institutional network, and they're only building just to those organizations related to the city, you know, public safety and libraries and schools and so forth. Now, there is some risk there, and we all know the spectacular failures of the past. The good news is that really taught us a lot, and we're not making those mistakes anymore. The nice thing is you control it, you have full access, you have a totally different idea of what a profit is. So if you are a city mayor, a county commissioner, really your idea of what profit is going to be determined by the benefit to your consumers, right? The benefit to the people who live in your community. It's going to be about, did you bring in jobs? Did you improve transportation? Have you provided for rural telehealth? So those are the benefits that I see in that. So the negatives, of course, is how hard it is to do. And boy, you really better have good staffing. There can sometimes be pushback from incumbents. And in my mind, you only go to this option if the market's not solving your problem, right? It's an option you should have in case the market is not solving your problem. And I'll tell you the story of two towns. So there's one little town is called Leverett, Massachusetts, and it's just outside of Amherst, which is a college town. It's a fairly affluent community, nice little rural community. They had only copper and only dial-up and satellite, and their copper was so bad that when it rained, they couldn't call 911, right? So they had a lot of issues. They couldn't entice anybody to come in and build. Nobody was interested. So they went to the voters, and the voters voted to raise their own taxes and build a fiber to the home network, which they're in the process of rolling out as I speak. They solved their own problem. It's what America's all about, right? We got a problem, we figure out how to solve it. Then contrast that with Thompson Station, Tennessee, a very, very similar demographic outside of Nashville. And they do not, neither of these two communities owned a public utility. In Massachusetts, you don't have to own a public utility to run your own broadband. In Tennessee, you do. And so they can't build their own. Nobody's coming in. Real estate prices are dropping. People can't sell their houses. Kids aren't coming back from college. You can't work from home. It's really impacting this community negatively. So in my mind, one of the things that I think we really need to, the way I think we need to shift this conversation is we really need to focus a lot more on outcomes. Because infrastructure is not the goal. It's just the means, right? This is how, nobody goes into this to build a network. They go into it for all the outcomes that are potential for their community. And I think we want to focus on that more. The data is really important, but the stories are just as important, because the data will win the minds of folks, but the stories win the hearts. And when we can get both, then we can begin to move the needle forward. We recently, at Next Century Cities, released a policy agenda that gave some concrete steps for all stakeholders to take. Local government, state government, federal government, philanthropy, and community. So at the local level, we recommend work on fiber ready. How do you get fiber ready? It doesn't matter if you're going to build your own, work with an incumbent, have a public-private partnership. No matter what it is, being fiber ready is a good thing, right? And that means, do you have a dig once joint use policy in place? What are your pole attachment issues? Expedite your permitting process. There are lots of ways you can help to begin to be ready for that eventuality. And in some cases, folks have then moved on and done some incremental things within their community because now they've got conduit in the ground and they can begin to make some connections. At the state level, part of it for me is really funding, like New York State has done, and like Massachusetts is doing to a much smaller extent, like Kentucky is doing with building a middle mile. Really removing some of those barriers that make it hard for local communities to build their own if that's the only option for them. At the federal level, again, funding. And then reporting requirements. I don't know how many of you have had to file a report on an RUS grant. If you had, you would know how difficult that process is. And in fact, one of our cities, one of our small communities, explained to me that he got a grant from RUS, and when he saw the reporting requirements, it would have cost him more to report back than he would have gotten from the grant, and he said, no, thank you. So we need to do something about that. And the Broadband Opportunity Council is actually collecting those kind of stories, and so a lot of our mayors gave that information to them, and they'll be doing a report out at the end of the summer. And then for philanthropy, we really think, again, matching funds. Funds are a theme here. It's expensive work. We need to get it done. That middle mile build out, that last mile build out. So we, of course, hope they'll support organizations like mine. And one of the things that we'd really like to see is more funding for research. I think it would help if we had really good data, but this is all new stuff. And so there's plenty of data out there that says, economic development is vastly enhanced through this, through good networks. But we don't have any long-term, really focused data. And none of the reports they don't match. I will say none of them say that it gets worse. They all say it gets better. Economic development is enhanced, but there's not a lot of clarity. We really need some good studies and research in that space. And then the community, of course, we want the community to encourage and support this work, and we want them to educate themselves on the best uses. So by elevating city voices, we hope we're making change. And I can't help but think about how when I was young, and not everybody in this room will remember this, but the whole space race, right? How the whole country got behind it, and we got really excited, and we made this happen, and we were all joined in this effort to improve our circumstance in terms of that space race. We wanted to be the first people on the moon, and we were, right? That was an amazing time. In fact, I talk about technology, we were watching a black and white TV, and we had a Super 8 camera videotaping the TV, right? Taping the TV. It was all very interesting. But I think that as a country, we need to get that kind of energy again behind this effort. We never wanted to be anything other than first, but we sure aren't first when it comes to broadband. So we want to give our mayors the opportunity to tell their stories. We want to talk about how their communities are impacted. We want to help them figure out what kind of network works for them and connect them with other resources and experts around the country. And so if you have an interest, by the way, please do feel free to contact me. And if there's some way I can help your county, your community, I'd be thrilled to do that. This has been a joy to do this work. I come from Boston originally, worked on the broadband team in Boston with CIO Bill Oates, who was really fabulous and creative and interesting. And I'm thrilled now to be able to help other CIOs around the country figure out how to do this work, how to be successful, how to really impact the quality of life of the citizens of the country. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Deb. That's inspiring, and I hope it inspires a few folks in the audience to get the ball rolling in their communities. New York City, the host of this meeting, is doing some absolutely amazing things in the broadband sphere. And speaking for Maya Wiley, who is the director of New York City's broadband office in the mayor's office, is Brittny Saunders. I'll turn the floor over to you. What's happening in the city?
Thank you so much. So again, my name is Brittny Saunders. I'm deputy counsel to the mayor of New York City here, Mr. Bill de Blasio. And I bring the regrets of Maya Wiley, who is counsel to the mayor. She was pulled down to DC this morning and so wasn't able to join us, but I'm really thrilled to be here speaking with you all this afternoon. And so our office, just to give you a little bit of context, the Office of the Mayor's Counsel has some traditional roles, so it's traditional legal advising, but in a kind of unique step, the mayor has tasked my boss, Maya Wiley, with really driving the execution on his commitment to getting universal affordable broadband across the 5 boroughs within the next 5 years. And that means that we work very closely with a number of other agencies. I would say primarily the Department of Information, Telecommunications, and Technology, so DOIT, as well as NYCEDC, and a bunch of others to make sure that we can really deliver on this commitment to universal affordable broadband. And as folks in this room know, I think very well, often people make the mistake of thinking that in big cities like New York, broadband is available everywhere. But our belief is that it's actually not. We really think that, you may or may not remember that as a candidate for mayor, Mayor de Blasio often referenced the kind of tale of two cities motif, and I think it applies in the broadband context as well. Certainly when we were talking about dial-up internet, right, we were generally talking about widespread availability just because of the availability of telephone service up until that point. And as we moved to DSL and cable, this was generally also the case, but now, as we begin to integrate new technologies like fiber and new wireless technologies, there are really large and significant divides in broadband infrastructure. And this is something that the mayor and Counsel Wiley are deeply, deeply committed to addressing. And so I'll talk about this in kind of 3 basic buckets, and then, and then we'll certainly open to questions as well. But we think about this in 3 basic ways. The first of these is kind of access, which is the availability and infrastructure question. And as folks, well, one, you may be aware that earlier this year, the mayor announced a kind of first of its kind, really kind of large scale investment in broadband infrastructure. So we're expecting to invest some $70 million over the next 10 years. And a large amount of that is going to be invested in wireless networks that will serve both, will be deployed in public spaces as well as providing some residential service as well. So we're very excited about that. In addition, we are, you may be aware of the Link NYC project. So this was the reincarnation of the payphones franchise, right? And a consortium of organizations came together and was awarded the RFP and has really put forward an exciting plan for providing super high-speed service in public spaces across the city, creating what we believe to be the largest kind of largest and fastest municipal Wi-Fi network nationwide. In addition, we also think pretty deeply about accountability. So we've always maintained that our franchisees who help us to provide broadband service via their cable franchises are our partners. We work closely with them, but we're also deeply committed to maintaining, making sure that they're accountable to their commitments. And so this is, both a tool for ensuring equity across the city, making sure that the kind of technologies they're going to allow for high-speed access are available everywhere in the city. And then also, maintaining accountability with respect to infrastructure upgrades. So to the extent possible, as technologies improve, making sure that New York City residents benefit from those improvements as well. And then the third area in which we think it's kind of incredibly important to be active is around policy at the, certainly at the local level where we have a lot of control and influence, but then also at the state level and at the federal level as well. So we've been active with respect to, last year, a lot of activity around net neutrality and around the Time Warner Comcast merger, as well as activity this year around the Lifeline reform and modernization docket, which we see as an important part of our strategy as well. So I think I will wrap it up there, and again, look forward to questions from this group, but I think the kind of take-home point is that we're really trying to take a really robust and cutting-edge approach to getting at that goal of universal affordable broadband. We really do see this as a, period of transition from a point when, many people thought of broadband as a luxury, right? And we think of it more as a critical service that all of our residents have to have access to. And with that in mind, we're really kind of using all the tools at our disposal to make that the reality.
Thank you very much. In terms of format, we'll hear short presentations from our other two speakers on this panel, and then I'll open the floor to questions from the audience. If you don't have any questions, and I can't imagine that that's going to be the case, I have questions of my own. But we'll move on now to New York State, which is doing some very innovative and really, I think, very eye-opening things in terms of expanding broadband availability to the citizens of this state. And I will, without further ado, turn the floor over to David Salway, the Executive Director of New York State's Broadband Office.
Stand here. Thank you, Commissioner Sayre, and welcome again to, we had a summit a few weeks ago now. Actually, it was about a month ago, and I see a lot of familiar faces out there. So it's nice to see the involvement in our partnership continues as well, and a lot of familiar faces from our meetings with Maya and her team as well. So I want to welcome everybody. I just wanted to go briefly, I know we're going to do a Q&A in a few minutes, but just tell you a little bit about the governor's broadband program and strategy that we undertook started actually a couple years ago with the Connect New York program. This was our $25 million grant program where we had 16 public-private partnerships that involved a lot of the whole mix of different broadband projects that you can imagine. We have the open access model. We had traditional providers, some of our smaller telcos, and then the rural parts of New York State. I see some of our white space partners out there as well in terms of some very innovative projects, in terms of some of the testing that we've done, and also some of our traditional partners as well, like Time Warner Cable and some of the bigger cable providers. So this was really a very successful program in our eyes because it brought together all our partners at one place. We sort of had the forum to be able to exchange information both on how to solve the problem of broadband access, availability, and adoption with our providers at the table with us. At the same time, we also had a mix of broadband adoption partners as well. Our libraries, our community anchor institutions represented. So this really started the dialogue for a lot of the projects that we funded with Connect New York, but also set the stage for what the governor did recently, which is during the State of the State announced the new New York broadband program, which again is a $500 million program. So we sort of upped the ante when it comes to the funding level, but also promised universal broadband for New York State as well. So this is a $500 million commitment, matched with at least another $500 million. It'll be more than that because the match commitments could be much more than that. And it really involves building on those partnerships as we go forward, taking those partnerships to the next level and solving with our economic development partners out in the regions. We have 10 different regions in New York State, and through the regional council chairs, working with them, develop a strategy for universal broadband throughout the state. Just real quickly, I know we're just in the introduction now, and we'll have some questions, but just kind of splitting it up, and I think covered it really, really great in terms of the three areas, looking at funding as a very important aspect of solving the broadband and the digital divide, but also policy implications as well. I'm sitting next to Commissioner Sayre here as I say that. And a lot of things that we see with our projects in terms of pole attachments and rights of way, leveraging existing infrastructure, really involve a lot of the policy aspects of broadband availability. And we found that going through them, it's sometimes just as important as the funding piece. So we made that a very important part of our strategy, is looking at all those aspects and working with our partners to solve that. And I think we already covered this earlier, but also the adoption issue. Both from a provider perspective, when you look at providers that are considering building out in an area, they consider adoption a critical issue because that drives their revenues in terms of wanting to actually explore an area or expand their service area. And for us on the state level, it's very important as well because of the public good, and we know that also breeds good economic development as well as public benefits out there and telemedicine benefits, for example, and so forth in every region that they serve. I'm going to wrap it up there, Commissioner, and just see if you have any questions in there. I think it's just an introduction to go through, but I hope that gave you a sense of what we're doing at that state level.
Oh, I'll have plenty of questions if the audience doesn't.
I'm sure.
And speaking last but not least is Robert Mayer, the Vice President of State and Industry Affairs of the U.S. Telecommunications Association, who can give us the viewpoint of his membership, which consists, I'd say, primarily of large telephone companies.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Sayre. Yeah, just to clarify, USTelecom membership does consist of the largest communication providers in the country, AT&T, Verizon, and CenturyLink, but also some very large mid-sized companies like Windstream and Frontier and Fairpoint. Some of these mid-sized companies are $8-9 billion a year revenue companies, so they're very large. And then we have well over 100 smaller companies, rural telephone companies. So we really do have the benefit of understanding broadband deployment from the perspective of companies that have enormous economies of scale and scope to companies that have more limited geographic density capabilities, and obviously the economics are impacted by that. What I thought I would do, I really wasn't sure what I would kind of organize, how I would organize my comments until I was here. But I think listening to David talk and listening to Brittny talk, there was a conversation about a tale of two cities. And we understand that and appreciate that, and I think we all, as a society, have a collective concern about adoption and how to improve that, and we have to work together in partnership to make that happen. There's no question about that. But I would talk about a tale of two models also, and that is, what do we do when we consider investment in broadband and we talk about universal broadband availability? So I'm going to start with the governor's program because I think there are attributes to that program that make a lot of sense to us, all right? So one thing that we heard is that there's a $500 million contribution that is coming from the state. I don't know, David, if that's coming from the state treasury or where that is, but it's clearly an investment that's being made by the citizens and taxpayers of New York State.
Correct.
With the expectation that industry will come in with matching funds. But underlying that expectation is a clear understanding that in the absence of that contribution, the investment would be uneconomic. And I don't think anybody would expect companies that are in the private sector to continue to make uneconomic investment because they'll simply go broke. And at the end of the day, we won't have anything. So we have to make sure that the economics are that it's an economic investment. And I think the governor's program has that as an underlying foundational construct. The other thing that I think is important about what New York State is offering is I suspect that the focus will be largely on areas that are unserved. And I know there's some language about underserved, and we can argue about what it means to be in an underserved area. But clearly, unserved areas, the problem there is that there are no private sector companies that have investment capital to make because they don't see a viable return on their investment in those areas. That's just a fact, and unfortunately it is often a function of geography and density and terrain, but it's just a reality of why there are challenges there. So I can always say that, you know, we are very optimistic and hopeful that programs like that work, but to some extent it will also depend on, and I don't think they're all yet defined, but I appreciated the fact that David talked in the context of dialogue and partnership, is people don't give $500 million without certain expectations. And if a contributor overreaches with respect to their expectations and creates obligations that in effect turn potentially economic initiatives into uneconomic initiatives, or you get to an inflection point where it's uncertain, there's going to be some hesitancy. So it has to be structured in a way that the contribution makes sense and it's obvious, and the investment decisions that people make, they can be made with some confidence. Now I'll just switch to New York City, but this is not a dig on the New York City program because frankly I don't know a lot about it, but I will talk generally about a different model. And I'll start with an interesting thing that I discovered this morning, because one of the one of the examples of what the Wall Street Journal ultimately called a spectacular financial failure was an effort in Provo, Utah, which was called the Utah Telecommunications Open Infrastructure Agency. Well, that became an acronym for the word utopia. And utopia sounds to me like a lot about we're going to get broadband to everybody in the United States. And, you know, the National Broadband Plan said that would cost about $350 billion. But putting that aside for a moment, there's a utopian aspect to that kind of thinking. There have been failures in cities like Philadelphia, in Croton, in Wilson, North Carolina, Connecticut, Philadelphia. And here's the problem. The problem is that we're talking about technology, and Wayne Gretzky said it very well. He said, I don't play to where the puck is, I play to where the puck is going. And the puck is going in a place that nobody in this room, I don't care how much expertise they have, is going to be able to credibly say what the technology and what the economics are going to be for an investment in municipal Wi-Fi over a period of 10 years. And they're certainly not going to be able to say what the costs are going to be, who the competitors are going to be, what the technologies are going to be, what users are going to want, what the challenges are going to be from a political and policy perspective, what the market will look like in terms of competition, what's going to be the impact when we have low orbit satellites, what's going to be the impact when Zuckerberg talks about putting drones up in certain areas that can provide communications. Nobody knows that. But I do know that a year and a half ago, this device was very significant, and today this device is very significant, and in a year from now there'll be another device that'll be very significant, and it may be on my apparel, or it may be something that I wear as an earring, but things are going to change, and that change is not going to be driven by policy or government. That change is going to be driven by innovation and by user interests and desires. And we can't predict anything like that. So when we make the type of investments we're talking about, if we don't take into consideration the enormous uncertainty around all the factors that will ultimately determine whether or not that investment is successful or not, then we're setting ourselves up for failure. And that's been proven time and time again. So I think the smart way to do this is to do this in close cooperation and partnership with the people who've been in this industry for over 100 years, who are responsible for innovation, who have to make the investment decisions, who have to make the very hard choices about what technologies and services they invest in and which ones they don't, and make sure that you're getting a lot of input from those folks. And once you get that buy-in and understanding, I think then you have a much higher level of probability of success. So I thank you for the opportunity to explain that.
Thank you, Robert. And I appreciate the correction. I'm behind the times as to how diverse a membership the USTelecom Association has. You go from the largest to the smallest. Well, we have heard from our first four panelists, and without any further ado, I'd rather answer the audience's questions than mine. So, Commissioner Eccles?
Yes, thank you. Brittny, thank you for being here. I'm from Atlanta, Commissioner, in Georgia. I'm very interested in the reuse of the payphone concept. And in fact, I just sent a note to the City of Atlanta Sustainability Director about this, Stephanie Benefiel, a former state rep. But my question is, what are some of the challenges that you're experiencing in actually being able to reuse this? Because I looked at the website and it looked like you're installing a brand new type of device. So you're actually just pulling out the old payphone and using the infrastructure, or help me understand a little bit what challenges we might have if we did this in Atlanta or part of Atlanta.
Yeah, I mean, I would say we're really excited about the project, and we feel. Oh, sorry, let me use my mic. I'd say we're really excited about the project, and things are looking good. But in terms of just kind of the brass tacks, and what you're asking about, like, yes, in fact, the old payphone structures will be removed, right, and they'll be replaced with new structures that have been designed by the consortium I was referencing earlier. I think some of the questions that we've had to look at and that the vendors on this project are looking at is, what existing infrastructure is in place. So which payphone installations already have fiber running to them, and what does that mean for what a particular structure is capable of? Where will they have to run fiber because there's not any already in place? So those are some of certainly it's not as if because you're using a new installation, all the other infrastructure that's already in place goes away and you're like starting from a blank slate. So you really have to kind of grapple with both the existing infrastructure and the kind of how you overlay these kinds of new plans as well. But yes, I mean, to answer your question in brief, the old payphones are coming out and they'll be replaced over time on a determined schedule by new installations.
So just a quick follow-up, if I may. So how important is it to you all to actually go into that exact physical locale where the phone was? I mean, is that more of a marketing thing where you're talking about replacing the payphones? Because we don't have that many of those left in Atlanta, and I mean New York's obviously very different than Atlanta. So. Is that more of a marketing thing, or are you actually trying to recover some infrastructure?
Some of it is about recovering and capitalizing on existing infrastructure. And you're right that like New York and Atlanta are probably two different regulatory regimes, different types of street furniture, different types of historic infrastructure investments. But, I think it's when there's like a range of factors that you need to consider when trying to figure out how to get coverage kind of across your city in an equitable manner, right? And some of that relates to like what's already in place, what can you capitalize on that's already in place, but then also like what isn't in place that's in areas where there's currently significant need, right? And how do you make sure that you're accounting for those concerns as well?
My question is for Mr. Mayor. I read a lot of this stuff, and I'm really have a passion for fiber optic adoption, and whoever does it, it doesn't matter to me, but it's important that it gets done for all the things that Socia talked about and how it touches our lives. So the question I have for you, and I would hope you'd be able to shed some light on this, and everything that I've read speaks to the collaboration between incumbents and people that want to get their speeds and their connectivity to a level where it has an impact on various things in their community, including economic development, some of the other things. The question I have is, how do we get the incumbents to really come to the table, want to work with the local folks where it really matters? Just want to get your take on that. Thank you.
I'm hoping that there isn't a single incumbent that is not willing to engage in a discussion with the community representatives about the issues about getting higher speed capabilities into a community. Let me just start with that. Part of it is an education process, frankly, and let me try to explain a little bit about what I'm talking about that might expand on some things I said earlier. For the last 2 years, I've been working with our members on working through the modifications to the Universal Service Fund at the federal level, which is called the Connect America Fund, where USF monies that were used in the past for providing voice services are going to be shifted now towards broadband. Clearly, a recognition at the federal level that broadband is becoming the key service of interest and how important it is to the country. they're talking about $4.5 billion for price cap carriers and about $2 billion for rate of return. So we're talking about maybe $7 billion a year in support versus the $350 billion amount that I mentioned before. So there is still a huge gap in terms of providing high-speed services in areas where it's not economic to make the investment. You have to start with the proposition that you believe that if you're a private company and you're talking to a private sector company about making an investment, that you acknowledge that that has to be economical. If you don't acknowledge that, then it's very hard to have a conversation, because the private sector companies have responsibilities where they just don't have the ability to make consistent uneconomic investment. Doesn't work. They won't attract capital, and at the end of the day, they'll be eaten out by a competitor. Having said that, if you look at the way the USF money is being structured and the considerations that go to what you were talking about, how do we get the investment in your community? The lessons that I've observed in terms of listening to the conversations about how those decisions are being made are based on a whole bunch of variables that need to be understood, and I'll just take you through a few. You have to make some assumption about what the take rate is going to be when you build out the investment. You have to have some understanding of what it's going to cost you to build that investment. And that's going to be vary tremendously by location. So it could be a function by how much density there is in an area. It could be a function of the terrain in the area. It will be a function of your existing technology. It'll be a function of the competitors in that area. It'll be a function of the consumer demand and expectations in that area, and a lot more. And companies have to go through the basic due diligence of understanding what the likelihood is, given all those variables, that given a certain amount of support for building out in uneconomic areas, that at the end of the day, that's going to be a worthwhile venture for them. So it really comes down to understanding the economics of the investment, and I think trying to work in a way that there's a real, genuine partnership and dialogue with the community, so that folks have an appreciation for that. I'm just going to, as a New Yorker and having worked at the New York Commission for 3 years, just kind of make an observation since I've been here in the last couple of days and reading some materials. I find it unbelievable that an organization that has invested $3.5 billion in fiber technology and investment in this city is not being praised for that, but is being criticized for that. And I'm not speaking for my association, but I will speak personally that I think that's shameful. Right? I think organizations that contribute so much to the vitality, economic vitality of a city, whether they support the financial services sector or they support residents throughout the state, when they make commitments to new technology in the face of very vibrant competitors. When you look at the numbers in New York in 2000, the incumbent had over 11 million access lines. Today they have 2.9 million access lines. I can assure you from an economic perspective that they have not shed the fixed costs associated with that decline. And I would even say that even the variable costs have not largely been affected. So unless you work from the premise that you're willing to acknowledge what the economics are, there's really no basis for a conversation around investment. So it may not be an answer that makes people happy, but it is the reality of the world that we live in.
Could I address that? So I think that was a reference to Verizon's FiOS commitments here in the city. And as I think a lot of folks in this room know, we as a city audited Verizon's compliance with that franchise. We had some serious concerns about whether they were meeting their commitments under that franchise. And again, this is a commitment to deliver and make its FiOS service available across the city. The results of that audit are public. They're up on our website, as is Verizon's response to that. I would say the city is not, like our intent, right, is not to shame Verizon. That's not productive. Our intent is to make them commit, to see delivery on the commitments that were made, right? And I think that's a different thing. And I don't think this is a place to necessarily haggle over every detail of that audit, but again, as I said, the materials are up, and I encourage everyone here to examine them. And I think they make clear that there are some serious outstanding questions. And we see that as part of our role here. As I said before, we view our franchisees as partners, right? We work closely with them. We have for a very long time. But again, where commitments are made, there's also got to be some accountability.
Maybe we can frame that discussion in a different way and put it within a global context. The idea that you can engage in a dialogue with a carrier that will ultimately enable them to provide service where services are not lucrative for them is a dicey proposition. And so if you look globally, what has happened in places like Finland is that the the Secretary of Communications, Madam Linden there, said, well, we're going to pass legislation declaring broadband as a human right. So all of a sudden they took it out of the context of technology and made it a human right because they knew it would be so important to social and economic development. So what the Finnish parliament did was to legislate that 2 megabits was going to be ubiquitous throughout the country. What then happened was that the private sector, which had its hand forced by the legislation, began to move and to talk to some of the smaller communities about providing the service. Now, it wasn't a heavy-handed approach, but again, it was an approach where service wasn't being provided. A more difficult discussion took place in Australia, where for 20 years you had an incumbent there who continued to promise but never delivered broadband, and as a result, there were economic consequences because Australia continued to fall down the ladder of economic competitiveness indexes. And so finally, the national government had to step in. Senator Stephen Conroy, also the Secretary of Communications, they have a communications secretary there, like at cabinet level, declared, because he had the authority to do it, that if the incumbents wouldn't play ball, that he would take the wholesale proposition out of their hands and create a national broadband network to the tune of $43 billion in taxpayer dollars, because they were losing their talent. The best and the brightest people in Australia, this is Australia now, this is not the third world, were running to Singapore, running to Silicon Valley, running up to Boston to start their businesses. So the loss of social capital, the government believed, was worth investing in to retain. And so they have a national broadband network. Art and I actually met a couple of the cities that are on that line, and they are now prospering. They are creating new businesses. They are starting to do the things. So there are different ways to look at the relationship with the carriers, as Robert suggests. And as Robert also suggests, we don't know what the outcomes are going to be, which makes it even scarier. But I always ask the question, how much did the Brooklyn Bridge cost? In today's dollars, about $145 million, if you believe Ken Burns' data on his documentary. If you go online, it's a terrific story. Now, you tell me, how much economic yield has the Brooklyn Bridge given us? It's probably at least $1 trillion, right? But if you go back and read the articles of the time, people were saying, why do we need a bridge? You know, river traffic between Brooklyn and Manhattan is just fine. Of course, they built the bridge, and within 5 years, what happened? We had the Williamsburg Bridge. You needed another bridge. So I guess the question I have, because this actually sounds more like a speech than a question, I apologize. But the question I have is, when we talk about the marketplace, we always assume that it's just the private sector, that somehow the private sector will arrive at their conclusion. I submit to you that the marketplace is also determined by government being innovative and understanding its role as an enabler for tremendous economic output. As David was saying, you know, now we've got a partnership in New York State where we bring all the people to the table. Who's bringing them to the table? Government. A proper role for government. So my question, finally, is what is the role of government in the marketplace as an enabler of universal broadband, and what do you anticipate will be the economic consequences of that? And Gregg, I throw that out to anybody on the panel. Sorry for being so long-winded.
Sure,
Take a shot at-
I'll take
okay.
a start at that, and then I'll pass it on. I honestly do believe that government has a fairly large role to play. I think the difficulty, as you were mentioning, is when you enter into an agreement with a provider, you have to have every expectation that they will abide by their commitments. And there has to be a way to hold folks accountable when they don't. Don't get into that commitment if it's not going to be economically viable. Once you make that commitment, we need to be able to hold folks accountable. I do think it would be very helpful if we had a much nicer relationship with all of the incumbent providers and government. It doesn't always work that way. I also don't hold the providers responsible for the problem we have in this country. We all own this problem. There's no bad guy here. I think the goal has got to be that we need to empower local government to do whatever they have to do to make this work. So I have small communities that have RFPs to get folks to come in and build out a network for them. They're willing to invest some money, and nobody wants to come. It's not economically viable, I get it. So let's not prevent them from building it themselves, right? Every option should be on the table, and we should, as a community, we need to think about how we have investments, how we can be a good partner, how we can create public-private partnerships, as I mentioned before, Westminster and Ting, so that everybody wins.
I would echo that. I think that, the role of government is really, where we're talking about a service like this one that's so integral to everyone's everyday life and is only going to increase in that way, right? It is the role of government to try to figure out how it can make sure that those needs are met. And I do think it's like an all-of-the-above approach that really makes that possible.
I agree. I think the role of facilitator is really critical, and that's what we did with Connect New York. And sometimes that facilitation role can take the form of other things besides funding. We've seen, partnerships even at events like this. There's summits where we have partners that come together literally at events and actually develop projects together. And that could be a wireless provider with a wireline provider. It could be an adoption partner, a library that's working with the provider to enhance digital adoption efforts. It's in many different forms. If that facilitation role is very important, and in that case, the government role would be to maybe forge those partnerships and then get out of the way in some cases. Other cases, it's more of a funding aspect where we're finding that where that economic piece is, wherever that break-even point is, that's where government can come in and fill that gap. And there's other areas too where that's very important. We have open access networks. We funded a few open access networks with Connect New York. This is building an infrastructure that many providers can use on an equal basis, but it's building that foundation where we can provide it equally to the providers that are in their respective service areas. So that's another very important thing that we've seen, and a lot of good results from that as well.
Are you testing out those open access networks? Are those beta tests, or are those full-fledged access networks in communities now?
These are full-fledged. There's actually partnered with Connect New York. We built the middle mile network where the entity built the open access network, but there were partnership agreements already in place for the last mile access. So they're being built now. And we have many authorities, development authority, the North Country, for example, that builds that type of infrastructure in upstate New York. And then we have other groups that actually do the same thing. But the partnerships are really key with that again. It's building the infrastructure, but if we don't have any partners to complete that last mile access, then it's not going to do any good.
Yeah, I'd like to, I rarely quote Google to support my advocacy, but sometimes it's very helpful. There's people are enamored with Google and with Google Fiber, and I think the Vice President of Access has recently made some statements. He made a statement a few years ago, which I'll refer to also. But to your question, he said, if you make it easy, we will come. If you make it hard, enjoy your, and then fill in the blank, he mentioned a particular company. He described the process of entry into markets as, quote, a Byzantine permission process. And several years ago, when he was asked in Congress whether he would be interested in providing voice service as a certified provider, he said, no, we looked at that, and we don't have any interest in that because regulation makes it too difficult and uneconomical for us. So what Google gets to do is they have a very different model. They don't deal with any municipality saying, you will come to our city, and by the way, we're going to make you adhere to these commitments, and we're going to audit you, and we're going to hold you accountable for every interpretation we make of the contract. And if we don't get what we want, we're going to figure out some other way to create some proposition whereby you'll have to give us consideration for some shortfall. What Google does is they wait till somebody says, please come in, we want you. And then they have a conversation about what that looks like and where they build their fiber and how they do it and who's going to benefit from that and what the price is going to be and what the speeds are going to be and what the timing of the deployment is going to be and what the scope of the development effort is going to be. And if you don't think they redline, think again, because they pick areas where they are either very attractive from a current perspective or have the quality and characteristics that they know are going to become a vibrant economic development zone. So I don't think there's a single answer in terms of how government can be effective here. One of the things that you certainly, I think, want to avoid is when government does things that undermine private sector investment, that's probably not a good idea. Disincenting the private sector from making economical investment is not good. When government tries to overbuild, that disincents the investment, certainly future investment in the area. When government picks winners and losers, for some reason, if you focus on making demands on an incumbent that is no longer the dominant provider in your jurisdiction, that's a problem. When government ignores the fact that broadband is, even under the changes of Title II, is not an interstate service, it's an interstate service, and thinks that they can deal with it as if it was an intrastate service, that's a problem. So good government means understanding all of those components and having a dialogue with not just the incumbent, but all the providers. It's not like the only obligation falls on the incumbent. There are other providers who are offering services. Many of them run away. They don't show up here at NARUC. They don't show up where they don't have to, where they think they might face some kind of government mandate. They resist regulation. They pride themselves on their innovation and their success that was accomplished without any regulation. And frankly, they're winning. They're winning customers. They're winning market share. They're globally very active. So we have to really change the mindset across policymakers of how they think about this industry. And if we're somehow stuck in an environment where, and I had this issue when I was at the commission. When I joined the commission in 2003, I had spent 6 months working with a cable company. I knew exactly what their plans were to come into New York State. And when I went to the commission and I told the staff there and the chairman, I said, look, these guys are coming in, they're going to come in very quick. They're going to take 20% market share pretty much overnight. And I had people looking at me like I had horns out of my head and I had no idea what I was talking about. And sure enough, they came in 2004 and they did exactly that, and they've been taking market share ever since. And to the point where now in many areas they have more voice customers than the traditional telephone companies do. So the dialogue has to be a very thoughtful one, and I think the New York State report, I was very happy to see that it recognized what New York had determined in Competition 3 proceeding in 2006, I believe, and said all the findings in the report that talked about intermodal communications, not only were they right, but there's more of it today, and it's becoming more pervasive. And none of those intermodal companies, or very few of them, maybe in New York with the exception of Time Warner Cable, they're not regulated. There's no economic regulation. There's no service regulation. Many of them are over-the-top providers. that leverage the investment that carriers make in the underlying facilities. If you don't understand that and you don't have a conversation that factors in those components, you're just not talking reality, frankly. And I think the best thing we can do is to be honest with each other and say, you have interests and we recognize your interests. We have interests and you have to recognize our interests. I think there's a lot of areas of convergence here where we can work together. I think the governor's program acknowledges that and recognizes that, which is why I'm hoping that it will be very successful and a model for the country. Because then we're really talking to each other in a way that says we have common interests here and we know that the ubiquitous and further development of broadband is going to benefit all of us.
We've got time just for one more question, and Commissioner Sandoval has been waiting very patiently. I think she will have the last question before we need to move to the next panel.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for this great discussion. So, two quick questions. So, Deb mentioned also like the possibility for lighting and intelligent networks and what that could bring in terms of services ranging from Wi-Fi to enhancing crime detection. Yet we see in city after city that are still doing tenders for streetlights that they're not including intelligent networks. So we're wondering what you're doing at the city level to encourage that. And then, second, one of the questions is also where we do see that not only is federal universal service money available to carriers in all states, but also some states like California have as well state universal service funds. And so one of the issues that has happened in the past is that some of the carriers have not applied for all the money for which they are available or eligible. And so, we'd like to have a dialogue about what we can do to encourage those applications to bring resources to the state. And where the carrier decides not to apply for either the federal or the state funds, what are they willing to do to make sure that that money is quickly made available to others who would like to serve the local communities, because it has an impact on education, health, and public services, firefighting, other issues for the communities. So thank you.
So I'll talk to the first question for a moment. And that, I have to say that the cool stuff that's happening now, especially around the lighting, I find really fascinating, including Wi-Fi hotspots, including cameras and a direct feed for public safety, all embedded in changing out the old light bulb that costs a ton of money to run and putting in new infrastructure that includes all of that, and it's cost effective. And what I'm finding, to be honest with you, is that folks are not so aware. And I think there's an awareness campaign we really need to do. And we need to help our mayors understand that this is an alternative. As an organization, we never support one specific vendor over another, but we are really happy to bring together a group of vendors to talk to our mayors and share their stories. And I think that the more we can get that awareness going, the more likely we'll be moving forward toward intelligent communities. I mean, I just think we're moving in that direction, but it's slower than it needs to be.
Please give a hand to our very distinguished panel and a spirited discussion that we've just had.